Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are bringing you an incredible true story that honestly has a little bit of everything.
It really does. It's a fantastic narrative.
Yeah, we are talking about highly calculated 18th century urban planning, an outright centuries-long religious rebellion, and an epic 14-year lawsuit.
A lawsuit that actually ended up shaping the modern commercial capital of Kerala, India.
Exactly. We are pulling all of this from a really fascinating historical document. It details the 52 Syrian Christian families of a city called Thrissur and their spiritual epicenter, which is the Marth Mariam Cathedral.
And our mission today is to unpack a very specific moment in time. We want to look at how a calculated royal decree back in the year 1796 managed to transform what was essentially a dense, heavily forested town into an absolute economic powerhouse.
And beyond just the economics, how that single decision sparked a fight for community identity that reverberates all the way into the present day. And you might be wondering as you listen to this, why you should care about an 18th century royal decree in southern India. Well, if you are fascinated by how cities are actually built from the ground up, or how communities manage to maintain their unique cultural identities against massive global pressure.
Or honestly, if you just love the twists and turns of a really complex legal drama.
Yes, exactly. This deep dive is an absolute masterclass in all three of those things. Okay, let's unpack this. Set the geopolitical scene for us. What exactly is happening in this region in the late 18th century?
Right. So we are looking at the Kingdom of Cochin in the late 1700s, and it is essentially sitting on a very fragile geopolitical chessboard. They're facing some very real existential threats.
From multiple sides, right?
Yes. On one side, you have the intense expansionist ambitions of Tipu Sultan of Mysore, who is literally breathing down their necks with a formidable military force.
And on the other side,
You have the looming persistent influence of European colonial powers trying to dominate the coastal trade routes. Into this incredibly tense environment steps a ruler named Ramavarma IX.
though he is much better known to history as Sakthan Thampuran.
Exactly.
So he steps into a pressure cooker. What was his strategy to keep his kingdom from just being swallowed whole?
He was incredibly shrewd. He ascends the throne in 1790 and rules until 1805. And Sakthan Thampuran realizes immediately that if his state is going to survive the modern era, he has to completely modernize his economy.
But more importantly, he has to consolidate his own internal power.
Right, and the major obstacle to that was Thrissur itself, which was then called Trikkur. At that time, it was not the bustling commercial city we know today. It was mostly dense teak forests.
And the entire area was centered around a massive ancient structure called the Vadakunathan Temple.
Yes.
And who was in charge of that temple area? Because reading the sources, it sounds like the king didn't actually have full control over his own territory.
That is exactly the problem he faced. The region was entirely controlled by a feudal class of Nambudiri Brahmins known as the Yogya Tiripads.
They were essentially running a parallel government.
They were. They controlled the vast tracts of land, they controlled the highly lucrative timber trade from those teak forests, and they hoarded the wealth. Sakthan Thampuran knew he had to break that feudal stronghold if he wanted to centralize his state's power.
How do you even go about breaking the power of deeply entrenched feudal lords without starting a civil war?
He makes this brilliant calculated move. First, he shifts his capital from a place called Tripunathora directly to Thrissur.
Moving the seat of government right into their backyard.
Right. But to turn a temple-centric agrarian village into a modern commercial hub, he needs a new merchant class.
People who are loyal to him.
Exactly. Loyal to the crown rather than to the agrarian Hindu feudal lords. So in 1796, the Maharaja issues a royal invitation to exactly 52 Syrian Christian families, known as the Nazranis.
And he asks them to pack up and move from neighboring areas like Oler and Aranatukara directly into Thrissur.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sheer genius of this geographical placement cannot be overstated.
Yeah.
He didn't just put them on the outskirts of town.
Right. The sources emphasize exactly where he placed them, which seems like the most crucial part of this whole plan.
He strategically settled these 52 Christian families right inside the fort gates of the city, immediately surrounding the sacred temple grounds.
He even repurposed old temple dining halls and gave them that land for housing and business.
Yes. By placing Christians inside the fort gates, Sakthan Thampuran intentionally bypassed the traditional, incredibly rigid caste-based restrictions of the time.
Because those rules dictated who could live, walk, and trade near a sacred Hindu temple.
Exactly.
Wow. So he effectively uses these Christian families as a legal and cultural loophole to bypass the Hindu caste rules that were empowering his rivals. That is incredibly bold. Did it actually work?
It worked flawlessly. This was a profound anti-feudal measure. He instantly created a prosperous, capable merchant class that reported directly to him.
What were these families doing once they got inside the gates?
Well, the families from Olor focused heavily on the timber trade, taking that monopoly away from the Brahmins. The families from Aranatukara, who were skilled in navigating the backwaters, managed water-based commerce and logistics.
And families from Ehrenburg handled the paddy trade.
Right, essentially becoming the backbone of the region's food supply chain. They also began dominating textiles and gold.
So they brought their trade skills and their capital, but it is clear they also brought something else that becomes the absolute center of our story.
Their faith.
Yes, they were East Syrian Christians. What did the Maharaja do to accommodate their religious practices, given that they were now living in the shadow of a massive Hindu temple?
To ensure they stayed and thrived, the Maharaja authorized the construction of a church right there inside the city limits. This was completely unprecedented.
Completed around 1814 and officially consecrated in 1815.
Yes, this became the Marth Mariam Cathedral. Locally, it is known as the Valaya Pali, or the Big Church.
The very first Christian church ever established inside the fort gates of Thrissur. I have to ask about the architecture here because the documents describe something fascinating. How did they design a brand new church in a place they had just moved to?
They built their history directly into the walls. When they designed the big church in Thrissur, they used the dimensions of the older church back in Uller, which is where many of the most prominent families had migrated from.
But they didn't just copy it. They specifically used the inner dimensions of the older Uller church to serve as the outer dimensions for the new Thrissur church.
Right. It is like a literal architectural nesting doll.
What a beautiful, tangible way to represent cultural continuity. It is like they were saying our new life perfectly encapsulates our old life.
It is a stunning physical metaphor. And the interior of the church was just as rich and symbolic. They imported these beautiful hanging glass lanterns to illuminate the nave, which symbolized the light of the gospel.
And the centerpiece is a very rare, historic, two-tiered wooden pulpit.
Yes. The first deck of this massive wooden pulpit is actually supported by a very intricate carving of a dragon's mouth.
What does the dragon symbolize in this context?
In their theological tradition, the dragon represents evil or chaos. So the pulpit, where the gospel is preached resting on top of it, symbolizes the word of God permanently triumphing over and crushing evil.
It is a very striking piece of craftsmanship. It sounds visually incredible, but the sources reveal that beneath all this beautiful architecture and symbolism, there was a legal time bomb hidden in the foundation of this church, right?
Yes, and this is what sets the stage for everything that follows. The consecration of the church in 1815 was performed under a specific royal charter issued by Sakthan Thampuran himself.
And this charter didn't just say you can have a church.
No, it explicitly stated that church services must be conducted in the Chaldean Syrian rite, preserving the use of the ancient Syriac or Aramaic language.
This encoded their specific East Syrian identity into the very legal foundation of the building. And they had the physical proof of this ancient identity sitting right there in the church library, didn't they?
They did. The library housed incredibly rare artifacts that prove their distinct heritage. They had the Kashkal, which is a daily prayer book dating back to 1570, literally handwritten with a quail feather and homemade ink.
They also had the Kudra.
Right, which is a massive 1,000-page Syriac manuscript containing the prayers for the entire liturgical year, painstakingly copied back in 1598.
Why were these old books so crucial? Why does it matter so much that they were writing in Syriac and practicing this specific Chaldean rite?
To understand why these books were basically treated as legal evidence, we have to look at the broader, very turbulent history of the St. Thomas Christians in India.
Tradition traces their roots all the way back to the Apostle Thomas in 52 AD.
Exactly. For centuries and centuries, these communities were completely culturally Indian. They dressed like Indians, ate like Indians, but they received their bishops, their liturgy, and their spiritual direction from the Church of the East.
Which was based in Persia, or modern-day Iraq and Iran. So they have an umbilical cord connecting them directly to the Middle East.
Yes. But then the 16th century happens. The Portuguese arrive in India, and everything gets violently upended.
Walk us through what the Portuguese tried to do.
The Portuguese arrive with a very rigid European view of Christianity. Through a major event called the Synod of Diamper in 1599, the Portuguese colonizers aggressively tried to Latinize the Indian community.
Let's pause there for the listener. What exactly does Latinize mean in this context?
It means the Portuguese wanted to completely sever the Indian Christians' ancient ties to Persia. They wanted to force them to adopt the Latin Catholic rite, conduct services in Latin instead of Syriac, and most importantly, bring them strictly under the ultimate authority of the Pope in Rome.
It was an aggressive campaign of cultural and religious assimilation. It is easy to get lost in all the different theological terms here, but for you listening, what this really boils down to is a local community refusing to be erased by a massive global superpower.
Absolutely.
They are fighting for their ancestral identity. How did the Indian Christians react to this pressure?
The immense pressure eventually triggered a massive breaking point in 1653, known as the Coonan Cross Oath.
A huge segment of the St. Thomas Christian community gathered around a stone cross, tied ropes to it so everyone could touch it, and literally swore an oath never to obey the Portuguese Jesuits or the Latin hierarchy again.
This act of defiance permanently fractured the community into two main camps: the Pazai Kutikar, who eventually decided to stay aligned with Rome, and the Puthankor, who resisted Rome and eventually aligned with the Syriac Orthodox Church of Antioch.
Where do our 52 families in Thrissur fit into this massive historical schism? Because they arrive a century later in 1796.
They occupied a very unique, highly rebellious middle ground. While many of them initially identified loosely as Syro-Malabar Catholics when they moved to Thrissur, there was a persistent, highly vocal faction among them that deeply resented the Latinized hierarchy that was still trying to control them.
They desperately wanted to maintain their pre-Portuguese traditions.
Right. They didn't want bishops from Rome. They wanted bishops sent directly from the Chaldean Patriarch in Mesopotamia, just like their ancestors had.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because they don't just complain about the Catholic hierarchy, they take direct illegal action.
Exactly. Throughout the 19th century, the Thrissur faction starts smuggling in and welcoming Middle Eastern bishops in direct defiance of the Vatican.
In 1861, a bishop named Martama Rokos arrives from the Middle East. He is the one who actually brought that 1,000-page Kudra manuscript we mentioned earlier.
And the people of Thrissur treat him like an absolute hero, but the Catholic leaders eventually pressure the local authorities to force him out of the country.
But the Thrissur congregation doesn't give up, do they?
Not at all. In 1874, another Middle Eastern bishop, Mar Ilya Melis, arrives. His time in Thrissur sparks what historians call the Melis Schism.
A massive portion of the Thrissur congregation formally and officially breaks away from the Catholic hierarchy altogether.
Yes, they consolidate themselves as the independent Chaldean Syrian Church of India. They even had a local priest, Mar Abdisho Thondanat, who went to incredible lengths.
He traveled all the way to the Middle East, got consecrated as a bishop by the Nestorian Patriarch, and then based himself right there at the big church in Thrissur until his death in 1900.
Okay, so paint the picture of Thrissur at the turn of the 20th century. You have a community that is now totally divided. You have the Catholic-leaning faction who wants to stay under Rome, and you have this fiercely independent Chaldean faction.
And they are sharing the exact same city, the exact same history, and laying claim to the exact same massive, beautiful cathedral.
It was a powder keg, and eventually this theological tension boils over, moves out of the church pews, and goes straight into the secular courtrooms.
This begins the infamous Treacher Church case. The sources describe this as an absolute legal marathon. From 1911 to 1925, that is 14 years of incredibly costly, bitter litigation.
Yes, 14 years. The Catholic-leaning plaintiffs sued the independent Chaldean faction.
What exactly were they arguing in court?
The Catholic plaintiffs' argument was essentially a claim of breach of trust. They argued, look, this church was originally founded for Catholic worship. These independent guys who have taken over are following a Nestorian faith, which the Catholic Church considers heretical.
Therefore, they are violating the original trust of the property and they need to be evicted.
Exactly. They wanted total ownership and control of the Martha Mariam Big Church, the cemetery, and all its associated properties.
Hold on, I want to play devil's advocate here because the context is wild. You have a secular or at least non-Christian state court in 1910s India trying to rule on ancient Persian church politics.
It is the ultimate historical irony.
You have a bench of Hindu judges in the Cochin state judiciary trying to decide who is a heretic. Walk me through how that is even legally possible without it becoming a total circus.
You have these brilliant Hindu judges, like Mr. Narayana Menon and Mr. Raghavan Nambiar, who are essentially forced to give themselves a crash course in 1,500-year-old Christian theology. They had to parse out schisms that date all the way back to the Council of Ephesus.
Break that down for us. What was the Council of Ephesus, and why did a judge in India in 1915 care about it?
The Council of Ephesus took place in the year 431 AD. Essentially, early Christian leaders had a massive, empire-wide debate over how to properly describe the divine and human natures of Jesus Christ.
And a bishop named Nestorius proposed a specific view that emphasized the distinctness of Christ's human and divine natures.
Right. The Roman Church rejected his view as heresy and excommunicated him. However, his theological approach survived and flourished in the Church of the East, in Persia, and by extension, in India.
So, the Catholic plaintiffs in India were using the term Nestorian as a legal weapon to say, these people are heretics and don't deserve the church. And the judges had to untangle that. Did they actually reach a verdict?
No, they completely deadlocked. It was a legal gridlock. One judge essentially agreed that the independents were schismatics. Another judge suggested the church might actually be Roman Catholic, which neither side was even fully arguing.
The state judiciary simply could not resolve an ancient theological dispute. So how on earth does a 14-year lawsuit finally end if the judges can't agree?
To finally put an end to the chaos and the drain on the community's resources, in February 1925, the Maharaja of Cochin steps in directly.
He appoints a high-ranking British official, C.W.E. Cotton, who is the agent to the Governor General, to act as the sole and final arbitrator.
Both sides agreed that Cotton would have the final, unappealable say on who owned the spiritual heart of Thrissur.
Talk about pressure. Cotton has to deliver a verdict on a conflict that has essentially been brewing since 1599. What does he decide?
He delivers his award in April 1925, and it is a massive, definitive victory for the independent Chaldean Syrian faction.
How did he justify it? What was his reasoning that the Hindu judges couldn't find?
Cotton's logic was exceptionally meticulous. First, he completely rejected the plaintiff's pejorative use of the term Nestorian. He noted historically that the Mother Church in Persia had never actually participated in or acknowledged the Council of Ephesus that condemned Nestorius in the first place.
So applying a Roman label of heresy to an independent Eastern church was legally flawed.
Precisely. He decided to look past the theological labels and instead examine the purely historical intent of the church's founders.
And what was the smoking gun that proved that intent?
It went right back to the beginning. He looked at the ancient texts in the library like the Kudra. But most importantly, he relied on Sakthan Thampuran's original 1796 royal charter.
That document explicitly mandated the use of the Chaldean Syrian rite.
Yes, for Cotton, the charter was undeniable, state-sanctioned proof of the church's intended independent East Syrian identity.
So the ruling gives the independent faction, locally known as the Yogacar's, full property rights to the big church. It freed them completely from the claims of the Catholic hierarchy once and for all.
It did.
I know the leader of this victorious faction was a very colorful historical figure who was leading them at the time of this victory.
The leader was a man named Mar Abimelech Timotheus. He is a towering figure in this history. He had actually arrived in India years earlier, back in 1908, all the way from Turkey.
Sent by the patriarch to lead a community that hadn't had a resident bishop for years.
Exactly.
The details of his arrival in the sources are so vivid. The community was apparently so thrilled to finally have a legitimate bishop from the Middle East that they met him at the Thrissur railway station and literally paraded him through the streets to the big church in a horse-drawn chariot.
He truly earned that spectacular welcome. Mar Timotheus reigned from 1908 until his death in 1945, and he fundamentally modernized the community. He established schools, he founded the Marnarsai Press to print Syriac literature locally, and he firmly relinked the Thrissur Church to the Universal Assyrian Church of the East in Iraq.
He became such a prominent figure that he was even respected by national leaders. Mahatma Gandhi actually visited him.
That's right.
Okay, let's bring this all back to the present day for the listener. We have this 14-year lawsuit resolved in 1925. We have the original 52 families settling in 1796. How do these historical events actually shape the city of Thrissur that exists today?
What's fascinating here is that the economic vision Sakthan Thampuran had back in the 18th century worked almost too well. The descendants of those original 52 families didn't just survive the lawsuits and the schisms, they became the economic titans of modern Thrissur.
The sources map out some incredible modern connections. If you look at the massive gold and textile industries in Kerala today, you can trace their roots straight back to the mercantile culture of those specific Christian settlers.
We're talking about the birthing ground for major modern banking institutions like the South Indian Bank and the Catholic Syrian Bank.
And the gold trade, which started with small artisans working right inside those fort gates, evolved over generations into global, multi-billion-dollar retail empires like Joya Lucas and Kalyan Jewelers.
The demographic and economic weight of the Syrian Christians in Thrissur is still absolutely enormous. But what is equally important to highlight is the cultural integration. They fought bitterly to maintain their distinct Middle Eastern liturgical heritage. They still conduct services entirely in East Syriac today, but they seamlessly wove themselves into the local, secular fabric of Kerala society.
And you can see that secular harmony in practice today, right? The sources mention a specific festival.
Yes, the Thrissur Puram. It is one of the most famous Hindu temple festivals in India. To this very day, as a symbol of mutual respect, the Marth Mariam Church donates oil to the Hindu Paramakavu temple during the festival.
It is a beautiful living tradition that proves Sakthan Thampuran's original dream of a collaborative, secular, commercial capital is still very much alive.
Absolutely.
That is a great note to hit. But is everything perfectly settled for the community now, or are there still lingering challenges?
It is important to note that the modern era brings its own unique complexities. Today, the Chaldean Syrian Church in Thrissur operates under a very democratic administration. The followers actually elect council members, which is specifically designed to empower the laity and prevent power and wealth from concentrating solely in the hands of the clergy.
However, managing that wealth today is incredibly complex because ancient family properties are now running into modern state bureaucracy.
Exactly. The Syrian Christian leadership today is frequently dealing with highly complex land disputes and modern debates over inheritance rights. For instance, the broader legal history of church property in India often intersects with modern legislation like the Waqf Act.
Can you explain that briefly? Why does the Waqf Act, which most people associate with Islamic endowments, come up in discussions about Christian church property?
It comes up in comparative legal discussions. The Waqf Act governs how Islamic charitable endowments are managed by the state. When lawmakers and judges in India debate how much control the secular government should have over any religious community's ancient trusts and properties, laws like the Waqf Act become the comparative baseline.
It shows how ancient religious trusts face intense modern bureaucratic scrutiny.
Furthermore, you see echoes of the old Tricker Church case in modern rulings, like the 2017 Supreme Court verdict regarding the Malankara Church.
What happened in 2017?
The Supreme Court had to step in to resolve a massive property dispute within a different Indian Christian denomination, the Malankara Church. The court ruled in favor of the centralized hierarchy over the local parish factions.
While it is a different denomination, that 2017 ruling proves that the historical tension between a centralized religious authority claiming ownership and a local parish demanding autonomy is still a highly active, heavily litigated issue in India today.
The echoes of the 1925 Cotton Award are definitely still being felt in courtrooms.
So what does this all mean? Let's zoom out and look at the big picture of what we've covered today. You have one monarch, Sakthan Thampuran, who makes a highly calculated urban planning decision in 1796. He invites exactly 52 families to move inside the fort gates of a forest town for the sole purpose of breaking the economic power of his local feudal rival.
And that single pragmatic decision builds an economic fortress that lasts for centuries, birthing modern global retail empires.
But the truly amazing part of the story is the human element. It is how those families and their descendants refused to just be pawns on a chessboard. They fought tooth and nail against global superpowers and local courts to maintain their specific ancient East Syrian identity.
They survived colonialism, they survived massive internal schisms, and they survived a grueling 14-year legal gauntlet, all to protect the heritage encoded in the stones of the Marth Mariam Cathedral.
It just shows the sheer enduring power of community identity.
It really does. And I think it leaves us with a very compelling thought to consider as we wrap up. When you look at the major commercial hubs in your own city, or even the complex legal frameworks regarding property and religion in your own country today, how many of those massive permanent institutions are actually the downstream results of an obscure compromise or a forgotten royal invitation made centuries ago by leaders who were just trying to solve a temporary crisis?
That is a deeply fascinating question to chew on next time you walk through your own city. The history beneath our feet is always so much deeper than it looks. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep questioning, and we will catch you next time.